The sterile hum of the bank office felt strangely suffocating, as if the very air was thick with the unspoken judgment of a room full of onlookers. Rachel, the CEO of a global tech firm, stood in front of the counter, staring at the cashier who had just handed her the most infuriating words she'd ever heard. "Your card is expired." The words lingered in the air, as if to mock her. Rachel's heart raced, not because of the claim, but because she knew what it meant. The second she stepped into the office, the assumptions had already been made. She was used to the casual slights, the undertones of disbelief that came with being one of the very few black women in positions of power. But this was different. This was a blatant lie, an attempt to undermine her with an insult so brazen it made her sick. The cashier, a middle-aged white woman, looked at Rachel as if she were a nuisance, a problem to be disposed of. But Rachel's gaze never wavered, the fire in her eyes burning hotter with every second. "No," Rachel said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "You've made a mistake, and you're about to regret it. In less than 5 minutes, the woman who dared to challenge Rachel's worth would be out of a job." But Rachel wasn't done. This was just the beginning. Rachel had always been driven by something deeper than ambition. Her journey to the top had never been easy. It was a battle waged in boardrooms, against not just numbers and market trends, but against a system that had long underestimated her, reduced her to a token in a room full of white faces. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, Rachel had faced countless obstacles, not the least of which was the color of her skin. The racism she encountered was subtle at times, but always there, lurking in the background, whispering that she wasn't meant to succeed, that people like her didn't belong in spaces of power. But those whispers only made her louder, more determined. She worked harder than most, double-checking her work, staying up late, making sure every decision was perfect. But no matter how much she achieved, it seemed there was always a reminder, a glance, a comment, that her success was always questioned. She wasn't just Rachel, the CEO. She was Rachel, the black CEO. The difference was always in the air, an invisible wall that kept her separate, even in spaces she had earned her right to occupy. Her rise to CEO had been meteoric, but behind the polished reputation and the accolades was a woman who had fought tooth and nail for every ounce of respect she received. She had worked with the most powerful and influential people in the world, but the battles in the corporate world were nothing compared to the microaggressions she encountered daily. At first, they stung, but over time, she learned to absorb them like a sponge, pretending they didn't pierce deep into her. She had to. There was no room for weakness, not if she was going to make it. Yet despite the walls that had been built around her, Rachel couldn't stop believing that her success had to mean something more. She wasn't just here for herself. She was here for every person who had ever been overlooked, for the ones who were told they weren't enough. She was fighting for the future, for those who would one day step into these rooms and not have to carry the weight of their skin with them. Her position had always made her proud, but on days like this, when she was caught in a petty confrontation, it felt hollow. The sting of what had just happened in the bank, the reminder that her authority could be challenged on something as trivial as an expired card, shook her to her core. It wasn't just about the humiliation, it was about the principle. It was about the lie. As she stood there, her thoughts hardened. This was more than just a fight for respect. It was about dismantling the very system that made moments like this possible. And this time, she wasn't going to let it slide. No, she would take this fight all the way to the top. This was no longer just about proving herself. This was about proving that a woman like her belonged at the very top, and anyone who dared to challenge that would have to face the consequences. Rachel stood there, her hand gripping the edge of the counter. The words, "Your card is expired," hung in the air like a slap. The room grew colder, the office noise fading into silence. Her face remained calm, but her mind raced. She couldn't lose control, not now. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with sharp features, looked at Rachel with a mixture of indifference and what Rachel could only interpret as superiority. Rachel's mind immediately picked up on the small but telling details, the dismissive tone, the way the woman avoided eye contact, and a strange certainty in her voice, as if she had been trained to challenge people like Rachel. Rachel blinked, processing what had just happened. This wasn't just an error. This was intentional. The cashier hadn't even checked the card properly. She had assumed. Assumed that a woman like Rachel, someone who clearly didn't belong in the same class, would have an expired card. It wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated move based on years of ingrained prejudice. "Excuse me." Rachel's voice was calm but cutting, the kind of voice that had silenced boardrooms full of men. "Can you check that again? There's no way my card is expired." The woman looked down at the screen, her fingers hesitating over the keys. A faint smirk tugged at her lips, and she didn't make any move to fix her mistake. Instead, she glanced briefly at the other customers in the line behind Rachel. There was again the subtle power play, the small act of humiliating someone in public, as if to remind them of their place. Rachel felt her chest tighten, but she fought it down. She had faced far worse than this. Racism, sexism, the kind of microaggressions that sliced at her daily. But something about the smugness in this woman's eyes pushed Rachel to the edge. This wasn't just a lie. This was a racial attack dressed up as a customer service issue. "I said, check it again," Rachel repeated, her voice unwavering, but the tension in the room was palpable now. A few people in the line shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between the two women. Some were curious, others appeared neutral, but there was a growing discomfort in the air as the power dynamic shifted. The cashier finally looked up at her, eyes narrowing. "It's expired. Maybe you should check with your bank," she snapped, the disdain in her voice clear now. Rachel stood up straighter, the sudden clarity of her situation cutting through the fog of disbelief. The moment the woman spoke, Rachel knew this wasn't a simple mistake. It was part of a larger pattern. This was more than just a confrontation over a credit card. It was a clear attempt to undermine her, to remind her that despite her status, despite her success, she could always be dismissed, reduced to nothing. Her fingers clenched into fists, but she took a deep breath, steadying herself. It wasn't just the card. It was the lie, and she wasn't going to let it slide. "No, I'm done," Rachel said, her voice firm now, no longer the calm so she had been a moment ago. "I'm reporting this, and you're going to regret it." The cashier stared at her, her face turning red, but Rachel could see the nervousness in her eyes now. The power had shifted, and Rachel, ever the strategist, knew it was time to make her move. Rachel's fingers twitched, and she could feel the anger rising within her like a tide about to crash. She had been calm, too calm, but now the floodgates opened. She wasn't going to stand there and let this woman, this cashier, try to diminish everything she had worked for. The lie, the assumptions, the racist undertone, it all hit her in that moment with the weight of 100 injustices. "I told you," Rachel said, her voice sharper than before. "You've made a mistake, and you're going to fix it." The woman behind the counter faltered for a second, but she quickly regained her composure, folding her arms defensively. "I'm not fixing anything," she said, her voice now tinged with annoyance. "It's your problem, not mine." A slow, cold smile spread across Rachel's face, not because she was amused, but because she knew exactly where this was heading. She had dealt with people like this before, those who thought their authority was unchallenged, who thought they could push anyone around without consequences. Well, today was different. Rachel took a step back, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor, her eyes never leaving the cashier. "You're about to regret this," she said, pulling out her phone. With deliberate precision, she began dialing the number of the branch manager. The cashier's eyes widened, realizing that Rachel wasn't just another customer who would quietly accept the insult. "You're calling management?" The woman's voice was laced with disbelief. "This is ridiculous." Rachel didn't respond immediately. She held the phone to her ear, as if the very act of calling had shifted the power dynamics in the room. Within moments, the branch manager's voice came through, and Rachel wasted no time. She recounted the entire incident in clear, measured tones, leaving no room for ambiguity. "I'm in your branch right now," she said calmly. "Your employee just lied to me, and it was no mistake. She told me my card was expired when it clearly isn't. I want her removed from the counter, and this situation handled immediately. The silence that followed was thick. The cashier's face had drained of color, her hands visibly shaking as she stood frozen. Rachel had already won. The call was the final nail in the coffin, and she could feel the walls closing in around the woman who had tried to undermine her. Within minutes, the branch manager appeared, his face tight, with professionalism, but clearly uncomfortable with the unfolding scene. Rachel didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You need to terminate this employee," she said simply, her gaze never wavering. The manager looked at the cashier, then back at Rachel, before nodding. "We'll handle it." As the manager turned and walked away, the cashier remained rooted to the spot, her eyes filled with a mix of panic and disbelief. She had no idea who Rachel was or what kind of fight she had just provoked. But it was too late now. The damage had been done, and the consequences were already in motion. Rachel stood there, her posture firm and unyielding, feeling the weight of every moment that had led up to this point. The confrontation wasn't just about a credit card. It was about the lie, the assumption, the racist attempt to disempower her. And she wasn't going to let that go unnoticed. As the manager's voice echoed from the back, Rachel glanced over at the cashier one last time, her eyes cold. "I hope you understand a lesson here," she said, her voice quiet but forceful. "You don't get to decide who's worthy of respect." With that, Rachel turned and walked away, knowing that this small victory would reverberate far beyond the walls of that bank. She had reclaimed her power, and the message was clear. No one, no matter their position, would ever dismiss her again. Rachel stepped out of the bank, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, the echoes of the confrontation still lingering in her mind. The world outside seemed unchanged, indifferent to the storm that had just passed. But for Rachel, everything had shifted. She had done what needed to be done, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, disrespected, or undermined because of their race. The cashier's smug face, the way she had tried to belittle Rachel with a lie about the expired card, had been a reminder of the constant battle she fought just by existing in spaces of power. But now, that battle had turned in Rachel's favor. As she reached her car, her phone buzzed with a message from her assistant. The branch manager had already sent an apology, a formal statement acknowledging the incident and assuring that the cashier had been terminated. The swift response was exactly what Rachel had demanded, but it wasn't enough. She wasn't done. This was just the beginning. Rachel leaned back against the car, her fingers tightening around her phone. The satisfaction of the immediate resolution was fleeting. She knew that while she had exposed one person's prejudice, the system that allowed people like her to be humiliated on a daily basis was still in place. The fight for real change wasn't over. But today, she had made a difference. She had taken a stand, not just for herself, but for all the people who wouldn't have the platform to make their voices heard. The feeling of power that came with her victory wasn't just a personal triumph. It was a statement to the world that she wouldn't let anyone, especially someone in a position of authority, reduce her to something less than human. Rachel knew this wasn't the last battle she would face. But with every victory, no matter how small, she was rewriting the narrative. She wasn't just a black CEO. She was Rachel, powerful, unyielding, and ready to fight for what was right. And as long as she had breath in her body, that fight would continue. As Rachel sat in her car, the silence around her felt oddly heavy. The confrontation in the bank was over, but its ripple effects were just beginning. In that brief exchange, she had not only reclaimed her dignity, but had also exposed something far deeper, an undercurrent of prejudice that, no matter how disguised, was always there. It wasn't just about a racist lie told by a cashier. It was about the systems that allowed such lies to fester, the assumptions made about people based on their appearance, their background, their race. In that moment, Rachel realized something profound. Her power wasn't just in her position or her accomplishments. It was in her ability to challenge the status quo, to expose the cracks in a system that was designed to keep people like her in their place. The incident with the bank had been a personal affront, but it was also a reminder that every microaggression, every dismissive glance, every assumption made about her because of the color of her skin had a cost. And she wasn't going to let those costs go unnoticed any longer. Rachel's actions were more than just about seeking justice for herself. They were about dismantling the false narratives that had long dictated who was worthy of respect and who wasn't. Her standing up, calmly but firmly, to the cashier wasn't just a fight for dignity. It was a statement. A statement that, no matter how entrenched the systems of power might be, they could be challenged. And sometimes, one small act of defiance could spark a chain reaction of change. This wasn't the first time Rachel had faced such challenges. She knew that for women like her, black, powerful, and unyielding, every victory felt bittersweet. The victory in the bank was sweet because it was personal, but it was also a reminder that her fight wasn't over. It wasn't just about winning this battle. It was about keeping the fight alive for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, everyone who had been dismissed or overlooked because of their identity. Rachel knew the path ahead would be filled with more struggles, more battles against biases and stereotypes. But in that moment, as she sat quietly in her car, she understood something critical. Her fight wasn't just for herself. It was for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And as long as there was breath in her lungs, Rachel would keep pushing back. Because the fight for justice wasn't just hers, it was everyone's. And every small victory mattered. As Rachel drove away from the bank, she felt a quiet strength settle over her. The world hadn't changed in that moment, but something inside her had shifted. The confrontation was over, but its echo would last. Not just for her, but for anyone who had ever felt underestimated, dismissed, or silenced. Her actions weren't just about winning this small battle. They were a declaration of something bigger. Rachel had reminded herself and the world that power, dignity, and respect could never be taken for granted. They had to be fought for, defended, and claimed at every turn. Her journey had been one of constant battles, but with each challenge, she grew stronger, more determined. The incident in the bank might have been just another day in the life of a black woman in power, but it was also a moment of transformation, both personal and societal. Rachel knew that true change wouldn't happen overnight, but as long as people like her continued to stand up, speak out, and demand justice, it was only a matter of time before the world began to listen. If you enjoyed Rachel's journey and want to see more stories of resilience and empowerment, don't forget to hit that like button. Make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss any of the powerful stories we share. Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. What did you think of Rachel's stand? And if you've ever had to fight against injustice, we'd love to hear your story too. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Stay strong, stay inspired,